There you are.
There we are. Welcome, everyone. We are so honored and delighted to be here with you today. And our president and co-founder, Avon Madison, was hoping to be here, but couldn't. But she is with us, she said, to tell you, and will be joining us in the future. So I think some of you might know that Pathways to Peace, I'm the executive director of Pathways to Peace. My name is Tezekiah Gabriel, and Pathways to Peace has a long history of challenge all forms of discrimination as we work peace through justice. So I am going to be the facilitator of our conversation today with Rich Shealey. Welcome, Rich.
Good morning. Good morning to everyone.
Yay, thank you. So I think you probably also know that these conversations will take place at this time in this Zoom room every Monday for 7 weeks. So please join us when it works for you to do so. So in a minute, I'll be asking Rich to share his thoughts with us about some incredibly critical issues that we are all facing in these times and that many of us have been living with up close and personal for a very long time. So we're allowing a little extra time at the end of our time together for your questions. So feel free to either state your questions in the chat room or hang on to them toward the end of the meeting, and we'll hope to take as many of those questions as possible. So before we begin, I'd like us to take just a moment together. Rich and I, and probably you know, that if change is going to occur, we need to be entering into dialogue with an open mind and an open heart. So as we come together, and most of us are coming out of very busy days, I know, let's just sit for a moment together and just breathe together. Allow ourselves to slow down. And imagine breathing through that space in our chest where our heart resides. As we join hearts, as we breathe together. As we breathe together, we open our minds, we open our hearts to the information that's going to be shared. Just breathing together. Thank you. Thank you for allowing that opportunity. So I'm going to begin by introducing Rich Shealey. Rich Shealey is known as the Light Warrior, and he is the founder of the Optimal Human Global Community. And the Optimal Human Global Community is a community of evolved and evolving humans of all ethnicities who are committed to doing their part to end racism as an integral part of the human experience. Rich is also the creator of Heart Transformed. So, Rich, are you willing to just begin our conversation together?
I am. And thank you so much.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
So go ahead.
I'm ready to start when you're ready.
Okay, thank you. So I think it's really important, and you and I have talked a bit about this, that this is so much in our consciousness right now, the confrontations between non-white people and police. And of course, the murder of George Floyd has launched a resurgence of the movement that has been afloat since the 60s, and that we have some hope perhaps that change might occur. But talk to us a little bit, give us your thoughts about kind of the confrontations and that what feels like kind of the never-ending confrontations between non-white people and police.
In order to context the confrontation, we have to go back to colonial days when the consciousness of the society we live in was established. When we were initially setting down the values of race, racism, white supremacy, and white privilege, because it's that context, the way our society is structured around those values, that creates the kind of consciousness within which these too often tragic events take place. Throughout our history, there have always been various instances where those values were reinforced and reinforced directly, usually accompanied by some form of trauma or bloodletting or both. And I'm really sorry that it is that harsh, but it is necessary to really communicate the importance of these encounters and what they're really about. What people usually do not think about when one of these encounters begins is that there are three levels of communication or three levels of information exchange that is occurring in the encounter, the confrontation. And the first of these levels of information exchange is an energetic exchange. Now, most of you probably have heard about the aura, which is an energy portion of a human being. But beyond the aura, there is also what is called subtle energy. And the aura plus the subtle energy plus the physical body constitutes what a human being is. Now, whether or not you believe this is true, I just want you to suspend your controllers on believing things that are new to you for the time of this discussion, if you would do that, please. So through the aura, which carries the authentic information about us, about the things that we value and the things that are pressing on us on that particular day of the confrontation, that information is exchanged between the police officer and the participant in the encounter prior to any words being spoken, prior to the time they come in direct contact with each other face to face, if that occurs in the transaction. So that information has exchanged. And that information can either represent a emotionally centered and balanced situation, or it can represent a traumatized and fearful situation. And this is the concern that I have so often with what we hear about the talk, where African American and other non-white families are having, particularly with their sons and with their children, about encounters with the police. And too often, they are giving their children instructions that include teaching them to fear the police. This is a strategic error. It's so important because when you have been taught to fear the police, that information is going to be included in the information about you in your aura. And when the police officer, male or female, receives that information, the fear that you're transmitting to them energetically could trigger their sense of fear and their sense of threat. And what that does then is it takes the confrontation out of a frontal lobe to frontal lobe exchange. It takes it into an exchange of trauma and threat, which explodes the confrontation in many ways, because there is in your brain, there is a shift from cognitive activity to what I call amygdala driven reaction. And that amygdala driven reaction is very much faster than cognitively managing that confrontation. So the police officer no longer has the same kind of control and governors and professionalism over their response in terms of their tone, in terms of their emotional control, and in terms of their physical reaction. They are now reacting driven by the amygdala. Now, if you aren't familiar with the amygdala, that's the part of your brain that is directly involved in primarily controlling your flight or fight mechanism. So, the transaction get very much out of control. Now, going back to families and this discussion of how to work with police, you don't want to have fear as part of your transaction, because you may overload the transaction, and for you that may be a life or death error, and we want to avoid those. What we want to try to tell our children is to, as much as possible, be emotionally balanced. It is not that these confrontations are not the time to assert yourself and assert your rights. There may be a time later legally to do that. But when you do that in these transactions and the police person is already in their threat mode, what you're doing is you're intensifying the threat mode and the challenge. And the whole reason this confrontation is taking place is to provide a sense of social control and to remind people who are non-white that the white person is in charge and in control. That's the whole purpose of what is happening. And if you have a difficulty subordinating yourself in that transaction, then you are potentially elevating the threat. And remember, what I'm communicating here is hopefully a series of thoughts that would be helpful to people in saving lives and moving through the transaction without overloading the transaction with emotion and taking the police person to a level of intensity that they might not otherwise go if you help them to stay professional. And you can help them to stay professional. I remember in my own life, this was years ago, and there had been another police shooting of an innocent, unarmed person. And I was saying to my then wife, I said, you know, I've never had that kind of negative encounter with the police. And her response to me was, well, you know, you got this aura thing going on. And I had talked to her about that many times, but again, your aura is going to carry forward the information in that transaction preceding any conversation between you and the police. So you want to be centered and balanced and not emotionally stretched and stressed, and don't allow yourself to do that, because that's going to give you the best possibility of getting through that transaction unscathed. Unless, of course, there are police personnel who have an intentionality of and I don't think there are many of these, by the way, but there are police who have that intentionality of making sure that you are conforming to the requirements of white supremacy, white privilege, race, and racism. But we want to avoid that as much as we can. So I'm watching the time, and I wonder if we should pause for a question or two.
I think we could do that. And for those of you who came in a little bit later, I invited questions in the chat room, or that we would allow some time for you to raise your hand and for us to capture some questions now. And you didn't get a chance to say very much, which I'm going to try to make the first part of this more efficient in the next time we come together, so we get more time with you. Because right. I think that what you said is so important from the perspective of who you are as a person who well, just all that you are, including being an African-American man. And as a white woman, I know that some things come up for me that kind of fit into the last part of what you said, because of course, it's a perfect storm, right? If you encounter the police as an African-American person who has been acculturated around fear, as you talked about, and that police with internalized racism running and what comes with that, that it's well, we've seen the results of that. And so just thank you for sharing those thoughts.
Yes.
So are there questions? I can see if I can, my screen was weird. So let me get here and try to unmute you. Thank you. I came in late. I love the idea of the aura in these interactions. I am wondering if you spoke about any impacts we can have on our aura that can help to diffuse from the fight, flight, and threat that you mentioned. That's from Amy. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, we can certainly, I spoke about not only the aura, but the subtle energy and the physical body. And this is one system. This is one, what I call being system that represents every human being. And what happens in one part of that being system occurs in other parts of the system at the same time. So when you're working with yourself as part of your consciousness, and you're able to authentically change what you value and change the stories that you tell yourself about yourself. For instance, all of us have in our minds a mental construct of how we're going to manage an encounter with police. We may view it positively, we may view it negatively, we may view it with fear. But however we authentically view that transaction consciously in our minds, that same story is going to show up in our aura. So for my own self, my view of my encounters with police, this is going to be a professional transaction. And I'm going to move through this transaction with the intentionality of successfully getting back in my car and continuing on with what I'm doing. That's the story. That's the story I've always told myself about that transaction. But if you tell yourself a story of fear, fear will be in your aura.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich. And thank you, Amy, for your question. Are there other questions? Any other questions? If I can see you, you can raise your hand. So if you want to turn on your video or give us another chat question.
I have a question for momentum purposes, as well as for the content of the answer. I've always wondered how, Rich, to make the bridge with what you're calling, well, how are people of color getting the word that they are one with the universe, that their energy, that their can be aligned, that they can in fact live from that alignment and reduce their fear in those situations? How are they finding this out?
They're not finding it out very often, and it's not just people of color who are not
exactly.
It's humanity as a family that is not finding that out. And what we're doing is on that continuum, because we want to help people get in touch with themselves, get in touch with the fullness of their humanity, because that's ultimately the answer. is for people to ultimately get in touch with the fullness of who and what we are as human beings, so that then we can understand that we are one family, and we are one life. Um, you see, the baseline of humanity is not our biology. Most of us think of the baseline of humanity as being our biology, but that's not true. Our energy gives rise to our biology. And so the baseline of our humanity is our energy. As Einstein said, everything is energy. And that's what's so important. And that's the baseline of these transactions as well.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that, Rich, because that leads us right into the work that you do. You know, that work that is really about working with individuals and groups to come into their optimal human potential, and that ending racism is a barrier to that optimal human potential.
Yes.
So we're running out of time, but as we begin to leave, what I'd like to do is have you talk a little bit about your work and how you contribute to what it is that Deborah was talking about with all folks, people of color as well as white folks. And
Yes.
while you're doing that, I'm going to pull up your contact information.
Yes, thank you. I strongly believe that there is greatness in every human being. And we have blocks to our ability to experience that greatness in many ways. One of the most important blocks to experiencing that greatness is to be unconsciously identified with the status quo. And what the status quo means is income inequality, white supremacy, white privilege, racism. When you're unconsciously identified with those things, in many ways, you will often be blocked, severely blocked from being in touch with your greatness, because your greatness is oftentimes only going to be experienced when you have access to your intuition, and your intuition is part of your energetic makeup, where so many other parts of your greatness would reside. And my work is all about helping people learn to live consciously beyond the confines of the status quo. We'll be talking a lot more about that as we go forward in these healing talks, but that's just a tip of the spear.
Thank you so much, Rich. And one of the things that you often talk about, which of course makes my heart sing, is that ending racism provides. So as we close, I want to let everyone know that we really appreciate you joining us. We appreciate your commitment to peace in the world and being able to affect our world by ending racism as a barrier to that peace, and that you are a pathway to peace. So thank you everyone for being here. We hope you'll come in again. The next Monday we're together in the Zoom room. Hope to see you sometime in the next few weeks. Rich, any last words? Any final comments, Rich?
I would just like to say that together we can solve these problems, and we want to learn to love each other, to be compassionate with each other, to forgive each other, and to live transparently with each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rich. And thank you for being here. We hope to see you again in the next Mondays. Wish you peace. Goodbye.
Bye.